The morning light crept through the grimy window of Arthur Ainsley's small council flat in Barnsley, South Yorkshire. It was another cold start, the kind that made the damp in the walls turn the air heavy, clinging to his bones. Arthur, 68, ran a gnarled hand over his stubbled chin and sighed. He eyed the half-empty jar of coins on the kitchen table, counting silently as he dropped in the last of his spare change. £3 and 40 pence. Not even enough for a loaf of good bread and a pint of milk. He rubbed his eyes, glanced at the battered envelope marked pension, and wondered, again, how they were going to make it through the month. He tried to ignore the sound of the boiler groaning and failing to come alive. The radiator was dead, the heating broken again, and the flat felt colder than usual. Margaret, his wife, was already up, tying a faded headscarf as she prepared for another shift, cleaning the local pub for £9 an hour. She caught Arthur staring at the coins and gave him a look that was half concern, half exhaustion. He tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Arthur's pride had always been his undoing. Decades ago, he'd been somebody. He was a stable hand at Doncaster, one of the last men to know every horse by name, every weakness and quirk. Then came modernization, machines replacing men, the cold logic of progress. Arthur was cast aside, his skills declared obsolete, his hands left empty. He found work wherever he could, odd jobs, nothing permanent. Now, he depended on a pension of £156 a week from the old mining fund, stretching every penny. He looked out at the street. His neighbors were mostly the same, old miners, widows, and a few single moms trying to make things work. The community was tough, but it was shrinking, jobs vanishing, homes falling into disrepair. Sometimes Arthur wondered if Yorkshire itself was slowly being forgotten, swept under the carpet of London's ambitions. That morning, with his wife out and the flat silent, except for the distant hum of traffic, Arthur made a decision he hadn't dared to share. He pulled on his old waxed jacket, the one with the Doncaster patch on the sleeve, and headed to the bus stop. Clutching the jar of coins, he traveled across town, not to the famous racecourses or bustling markets, but to a quieter place, the RSPCA Rescue Center in Rotherham. Arthur had seen an ad, buried in the classifieds, hardly noticed, a horse up for adoption. He walked through the muddy yard, past barking dogs and abandoned cats, until he found her. Kestrel. 8 years old, ribs showing through a patchy coat, one leg slightly favoring the other. She looked at him with wary eyes, the kind that had seen too much. A volunteer explained her story. She belonged to a farmer from the Peak District, a man bankrupted in the last recession, forced to sell everything. Kestrel had been left behind, neglected for 6 months, her fate almost sealed, destined for euthanasia if nobody took her in. Arthur ran his hand along her neck, felt the shiver of fear beneath his touch. He saw something there, a spark, faint but real. He asked the volunteer about adoption. The fee was £500, a fortune for a man counting coins. But Arthur nodded, voice steady. "I'll take her," he said. He didn't tell the staff about his past. Let them think he was just another old man, lonely in retirement, looking for companionship. When they warned him, "She'll never race again," Arthur only smiled, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. The world might have moved on, but some things, hope, pride, refused to die so easily. He walked home through the biting wind, papers in hand, mind racing. By the time he stepped into the kitchen, Margaret was back, her face drawn tight with fatigue. She saw the adoption forms, the official stamp, and stopped in her tracks. "Arthur, what have you done?" He hesitated, then told her the truth. £500, he admitted, from this month's pension. Margaret's voice rose. £500? From this month's pension? What about rent, council tax, food? Arthur, please, we can barely keep the lights on. And now you... Arthur raised his hand, not in anger, but in a plea. "Trust me, just this once," he said quietly. But Margaret shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. She listed the numbers out loud, their grim monthly math, pension, her wages, a few pounds from cleaning jobs, rent was $420, utilities another $180, groceries $280, transport $60. That left £44 on a good month for everything else. They were one missed payment away from losing everything. Arthur tried to explain, but the words sounded hollow. He saw the disbelief in her eyes, the fear. He went to bed that night feeling smaller than he had in years, the weight of the gamble crushing his chest. The next morning, as Arthur prepared to visit Kestrel at the stable, a new worry arrived in the form of a newspaper headline. Doncaster's glory to become luxury housing. A developer named Julian Sterling, young, sharp-suited, fresh from London, had bought the old racing grounds. Sterling Properties planned to bulldoze the site, build 200 homes for city executives. The article painted it as modernization, progress. For Arthur, it was the final nail in the coffin of everything he'd ever known. Margaret read the article in silence, her fingers trembling. Arthur saw the way her mouth tightened, the way she fought back the urge to scream. The past wasn't just fading, it was being erased, piece by piece. Julian Sterling was everywhere, on LinkedIn, in the local press, posting about transforming Yorkshire for a new era. Arthur didn't have social media. He barely understood email. He felt invisible, like the world had become a place for other people, people with money, power, and connections. All he had left was Kestrel, in a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, one last race could prove something, not to the world, but to himself. As the first week passed, Arthur faced new challenges. The car broke down. The electric meter flashed red. Margaret worked extra shifts, her health suffering. Arthur spent evenings with Kestrel, cleaning her stall, talking to her in the soft voice only animals understand. She responded slowly, letting him touch her head, nuzzling his shoulder. On nights when the world felt cruelest, Arthur clung to that fragile bond. But trouble was brewing. Rumors spread in the community. Some neighbors whispered that Arthur had lost his mind. Others remembered his old days at Doncaster, the horse whisperer, they called him, half in jest, half in awe. A few reached out, offering an old blanket or a bag of apples for Kestrel. It wasn't much, but in a world grown harsh, small kindnesses mattered. And somewhere in a gleaming London office, Julian Sterling set his sights on Barnsley, not knowing that an old man with nothing left to lose was about to stand in his way. Rain lashed the windows of Arthur's tiny council flat as he tried to sleep, the dull ache in his chest keeping him awake. Each time he closed his eyes, he pictured Kestrel standing alone in that cold, leaky stall. Just another forgotten animal, on the edge of being discarded forever. The cost weighed on his mind, but the feeling of purpose, of waking up for something that mattered, gave him the strength to swing his tired legs out of bed every morning. If he could save her, maybe he could save a piece of himself. The next day, Arthur bundled up and made his way to the makeshift training ground on the edge of Barnsley. There was no lush green paddock, no famous Yorkshire hills rolling in the background, just an abandoned industrial estate, chain-link fencing, and the muddy remains of a loading yard. Arthur had scraped together £50 to rent the place from the council each month, a deal struck with an old mate from the Working Men's Club who now worked for local government. It was a far cry from Doncaster's glory, but it was all he had. Kestrel greeted him with nervous energy, pacing the fence line as Arthur approached. He set about his work, methodical and quiet, recalling every trick he'd learned in decades around horses. No fancy feeds, no cutting-edge supplements. He begged leftover grain from the bakery down the road and even bartered with the owner of a local brewery for stale barley. The city kids passing on their bikes stared at him like he was some mad relic, but Arthur paid them no mind. His world narrowed to Kestrel and the challenge of making her whole again. He didn't believe in magic. What he did believe in was time, patience, and respect for the animal. Kestrel's legs were stiff, her eyes dull, but every day Arthur worked to bring her back, stretching her muscles, cleaning her coat, feeding her by hand. She'd flinch when he first touched her flank, but after a week, she let out a tired whinny and nuzzled his chest, just for a moment. That moment made the pain of living worthwhile, but reality loomed like a storm cloud. The adoption fee had emptied his bank account. The rent for the makeshift yard was another expense. Margaret's silence at home was colder than the weather outside. She'd started working extra shifts, coming home with her hands raw and her voice hoarse. Arthur hated what his obsession was doing to her, but he was trapped, caught between the life he once had and the fading hope of saving Kestrel. Word of his project spread through the neighborhood. Some of the old-timers from the Working Men's Club remembered Arthur from years ago. They stopped by the training ground out of curiosity, watching as the old man worked with the battered horse. One afternoon, Davy O'Brien, who still wore his Doncaster track cap like a badge of honor, leaned over the fence. "Arthur, what are you doing out here, mate? You planning to ride her in the next Grand National?" Arthur grinned, a spark of pride flickering. "Maybe not the National, but she deserves a chance." "Don't we all?" Davy's laugh was rough, but kind. "Most blokes our age are busy counting pills, not trying to save a knackered nag," he teased. Still, the word spread. A few more of the regulars began to show up, bringing cast-off gear, an old saddle, some brushes, even a pair of boots from a jockey who'd passed on. It wasn't much, but to Arthur it was everything. One evening at the pub, Margaret overheard the club president talking about Arthur's project. At first she burned with embarrassment, but as the stories grew, about the old Doncaster legend giving one more shot, about the underdog horse and her stubborn trainer, she saw something new in their faces. Pride. The men started a collection jar, tossing in their spare change, and one Saturday, the pub held a second-hand sale. By the end of the week, they'd raised £1,200, enough to keep Arthur's dream alive for a while longer. But there was another story brewing, one with teeth. Julian Sterling's property empire was making waves in the local press. He wasn't just buying the old Doncaster stables. His company was snapping up sites across Yorkshire, pushing for development permits to turn history into luxury condos. Sterling was a different breed, no top hat or racing silks, just a sharp suit, expensive shoes, and a perfectly curated social media presence. Every week there was a new post. Modernizing Yorkshire, bringing prosperity to the north. But in the pubs and the council flats, people muttered that all he was bringing was more ways for rich Londoners to get richer. Sterling Properties was under pressure. Julian's investors wanted fast returns, and the delays in getting building permits were costing him £50,000 a month in loan payments. In a smart move, Julian launched a PR campaign. He started a hashtag, #ModernYorkshire, and wrote op-eds in the local papers about how progress meant letting go of the past. His people even contacted the council, lodging complaints about unsanitary conditions at the abandoned training yard where Arthur worked. Before long, Arthur received a letter warning that his permit could be revoked. Margaret, now cleaning at the same pub where the local councillors met, overheard Julian in person. She heard him joke about how easy it would be to shut Arthur down. "Old man thinks he's running a charity, but rules are rules," Julian said, sipping his wine. "We can't have that sort of liability hanging around. Makes the whole area look bad." Margaret clenched her fists, furious but powerless. She'd always kept her distance from Arthur's horse obsession, but hearing the developer talk about her husband like he was an inconvenience to be swept away awakened a fire in her. That night, she told Arthur what she'd heard, her voice trembling. "They're coming for you, Arthur. For Kestrel. If they pull your permit, you'll lose her, and we'll lose everything we have left." Arthur nodded. He felt the pressure mounting, the rent overdue, the warning letters piling up, his wife exhausted, his own body aching. He had one option left, to get Kestrel ready for a real race. Not the Grand National, but the Northern Stakes at Catterick. The entry fee alone was £3,000, a king's ransom for people like Arthur. He couldn't do it alone. The community rallied. Another fundraising drive. Davy organized a quiz night. The pub hosted a charity walk. Someone even set up a GoFundMe page. It wasn't enough. In desperation, Arthur pawned his wedding ring for £180. Margaret, swallowing her pride, took extra cleaning shifts every day of the week. They borrowed £800 from the local credit union, even though the interest was brutal. The risk was crushing. If they missed one rent payment, the council could evict them. If Arthur failed, they'd be out on the street. With nothing. In the middle of all this, something incredible happened. A teenager who lived down the block filmed Arthur training Kestrel, an old man, hunched and determined, coaxing life back into a broken horse. She posted the video on TikTok with the caption, OAP versus developer David and Goliath. Yorkshire style. The video went viral, 2.3 million views in a week. The hashtag, #SaveKestrel, started trending across England. Strangers donated what they could, £5 here, £20 there. Within 48 hours, £47,000 poured in. Local news showed up, BBC, ITV, even The Guardian. Suddenly, Arthur was a symbol, not just of a man fighting for a horse, but of an entire community fighting to keep its soul. Julian Sterling watched the news, tight-lipped. He hadn't expected an old man and a rescue horse to become a PR nightmare. Investors called, nervous about the backlash. The council hesitated, afraid of angering voters. The fight was no longer just about a plot of land. It was about the heart of Yorkshire. Back in Barnsley, Arthur counted the donations, stunned by the outpouring of support. Margaret, exhausted but proud, wrapped her arms around him in the kitchen. For the first time in years, Arthur allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win. But even as he let himself hope, he knew this battle was just beginning. Because men like Julian Sterling didn't back down easily, and Arthur still had secrets, ones he'd kept buried for 20 years, secrets that could change everything. Arthur's name was suddenly everywhere. His face, lined with years of hardship, appeared on BBC Look North, ITV Yorkshire, even in The Guardian's online features about Yorkshire's last horseman. The donations kept rolling in, people stopped him on the street to shake his hand, and Margaret, for the first time in decades, looked at her husband with pride that softened the worry lines on her face. Kestrel, once the town's forgotten and broken horse, became a symbol for something no developer could buy: dignity, second chances, and the spirit of Yorkshire. But with all the attention came old ghosts. Arthur felt them every night as he sat in the dark kitchen, counting the new donations and listening to Margaret breathe softly in the next room. He told himself he was just grateful, but deep inside, something twisted. He had never been comfortable in the spotlight. The last time his name had been famous in the world of racing, it had almost destroyed his life. The truth was, Arthur hadn't left Doncaster Racecourse by choice. 20 years earlier, he had discovered a terrible secret: trainers doping horses with cocaine and steroids, risking both animals and reputations for a few extra wins. Arthur, stubborn and old-fashioned, did what he thought was right. He reported them. The racing world turned on him overnight. Trainers called him a liar, someone who destroyed livelihoods. Some threatened him and his family. He lost his job, his friends, his place in the racing world, and most of all, his trust in people. Margaret nearly left him then too, but loyalty and love kept her by his side. Their only son, angry and embarrassed by the scandal, left for Australia, leaving Arthur with a hole in his heart that no victory could fill. One cold afternoon, a local journalist named Claire Metcalf, sharp-eyed and persistent, knocked on Arthur's door. She wanted to write a feature for the Yorkshire Post, not just about the viral story, but about Arthur's past. "You were the whistleblower, weren't you?" she said, flipping through old headlines, her recorder on the table. "That took guts." Arthur stared at his tea, hands shaking a little. 20 years ago, I reported trainers giving horses cocaine, steroids, he said, his accent thick, his eyes somewhere far away. They said I destroyed livelihoods. Maybe I did. But horses were dying. Nobody cared until it was too late. Claire nodded, sympathetic. You paid a price for honesty. Arthur shrugged. Some things are worth paying for. The story hit the local papers, then the nationals. Messages poured in, some angry, most supportive, a few from old colleagues who told him he'd done the right thing, even if they'd been too afraid to say so back then. Margaret found a dusty shoebox in the cupboard. Inside, she'd kept clippings, letters, and even a photograph of Arthur with a legendary horse, Midnight Thunder, at Doncaster before the scandal. She placed the box on the table beside the growing mountain of donations and bills, a silent gesture that said, I see you. I remember. But with the past came new complications. Among the headlines was a name: Julian Sterling. The developer was no longer just a faceless enemy. He had history with Arthur, though few knew it yet. One evening, as Margaret sorted through the shoebox, she found a faded letter from the racing authorities' investigation into the doping scandal. She gasped when she saw a familiar surname. "Arthur, look at this," she said, handing him the letter. "Richard Sterling. He was one of the trainers you reported, wasn't he?" Arthur's hands clenched around the paper. Richard Sterling. The name brought a chill. Richard had lost everything after the investigation: his license, his stable, his fortune. He'd taken his own life in 2008. Julian Sterling was his son. Now it made sense. Why the developer was so determined to wipe the old Doncaster grounds from the map, why he seemed to have a personal vendetta against Arthur and the racing community. For Julian, this wasn't just business, it was revenge. Arthur felt the weight of that realization settle in his gut. He kept the truth to himself, not wanting to worry Margaret further, but he knew deep down that the battle for Kestrel, and for everything he'd come to stand for, was now tangled up with a family tragedy that neither side could escape. Even as this truth simmered in the background, there was another twist to Kestrel's story. An email arrived from Kestrel's previous owner, the bankrupt farmer in the Peak District. He wrote, "I heard what you're doing for her. She's got good blood, Arthur. She's not just any horse. She's the granddaughter of Midnight Thunder." The words made Arthur's heart pound. Midnight Thunder, the very horse Arthur had trained before his world collapsed, the horse whose victory had been tainted by scandal but whose talent was undeniable. Arthur didn't trust easily anymore. He paid £200 for a DNA test, scraping the money from the donations. The results arrived. A perfect match. Kestrel was family, a living piece of Arthur's lost legacy. The realization hit him with bittersweet force. Kestrel's potential had been hidden by neglect and bad luck, but now, with the right training, she could shine. Maybe, just maybe, her comeback could redeem not just a single horse, but all the years Arthur had spent in the shadows. Arthur began to train Kestrel with new intensity. Every morning, rain or shine, he led her down the towpath beside the canal, building her muscles, teaching her to trust again. The transformation was slow, but undeniable. Week by week, Kestrel gained weight, her coat grew glossy, her spirit revived. By the end of 3 months, she'd gone from 420 kilograms to 485 kilograms, and her top speed on the gallop had nearly doubled. Local tradesmen chipped in. Jimmy the farrier offered shoes for free. Doc Burns, the retired vet, checked her health at a discount. And teenagers from the estate came by after school to muck out stalls and help groom her. The pub became the unofficial headquarters of the Save Kestrel campaign. Posters went up. Community meetings buzzed with plans for the race at Catterick. Margaret, no longer just the worried wife, became campaign manager, organizing volunteers, managing funds, and feeding the reporters who now camped outside their flat. Julian Sterling, meanwhile, watched in mounting frustration. His lawyers tried every tactic to block Arthur's entry into the Northern Stakes. They filed complaints about health and safety, tried to have Arthur's training lease revoked, and even hinted at improper fundraising. But the community fought back. Letters flooded the council, reporters questioned every delay, and the councilors who tried to evict Arthur found themselves hounded by journalists and angry locals. Still, Arthur knew that everything hinged on the race itself. He spent long nights talking quietly to Kestrel, confessing his fears, promising her that whatever happened, she would never be abandoned again. Sometimes he wished he could believe it himself. A few days before the race, a letter arrived from the racing authority. "Your entry for Kestrel is approved, pending final inspection." Arthur's hands shook as he read it. For the first time in years, hope felt real. The morning of the last training session, Arthur stood by Kestrel's stall, Margaret by his side. The dawn was gray and cold, but there was a kind of warmth in the air, a sense that something big was coming. Margaret squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens, Arthur, you did right by her. and by yourself. Arthur closed his eyes, letting the truth sink in. He wasn't just fighting for Kestrel. He was fighting for every lost cause, every underdog, every person told they were too old, too poor, too broken to matter. As the final preparations for Catterick began, the entire community held its breath. Arthur, for the first time since Doncaster, let himself believe that this wasn't the end of his story, but the start of something new. The town of Barnsley hadn't seen such excitement in years. For weeks, posters plastered shop windows. "Arthur's Army! Support Kestrel at Catterick!" And old blokes at the Working Men's Club swapped stories about race days gone by. Kids from the estate who used to snicker at Arthur's muddy boots now begged their parents to let them come to the race. At the pub, a faded photograph of Arthur and Midnight Thunder hung behind the bar, a silent reminder that even legends could rise from ordinary lives. But on the morning of the race, as Arthur sipped his tea in the cold kitchen, a sharp knock rattled the flat's thin door. Margaret answered, her nerves on edge, only to find two stern-faced council officers flanked by a uniformed police constable. Arthur's heart thudded as he listened to the officer read a letter. Effective immediately, his lease on the makeshift training yard was revoked. "You are to vacate the premises within 24 hours, Mr. Ainsley. Failure to do so may result in criminal proceedings." Arthur stared, speechless. The words echoed in his mind, each one a blow. Julian Sterling. He had to be behind this. Margaret's face went white as she clutched his arm. "What does this mean for the race?" she whispered. "It means," the council officer replied, almost apologetically, "you're not legally registered as a trainer anymore. Your entry at Catterick may be invalid." "I'm sorry, Mr. Ainsley, but rules are rules," Margaret pleaded, voice trembling. "Please, this isn't right. He's done nothing wrong." The officer shook his head. "It's out of my hands." By the time they left, Arthur's hands were shaking. Everything he'd worked for, gone with a signature and a stamp. His mind raced. No training yard meant no registered address. No address, no race entry, no race, no hope. Word spread fast. Within hours, 50 neighbors crowded outside the training ground, forming a human barricade as council workers arrived to post eviction notices. Davy O'Brien stood at the front, his battered Doncaster cap pulled low. "You'll have to go through us, lads," he growled, defiant as ever. Journalists arrived next, eager for a headline. Community rallies behind Arthur as council moves to evict. BBC cameras captured the standoff, and by midday, even the local opposition MP showed up to plead Arthur's case. "This is bureaucracy run amok," she shouted, waving a stack of signatures. "We will not let this injustice stand." Inside the training yard, Arthur tried to keep Kestrel calm as her stall was pounded by the noise of shouting and camera flashes. Margaret wiped her tears, jaw set. "We're not leaving," she said, voice low and firm. "Not until someone explains why." For 24 hours, the standoff continued. Police threatened arrests, but the crowd held firm, singing old Yorkshire songs and waving hand-painted banners. "Arthur's Army! Save Kestrel! Yorkshire stands together!" At the pub, Margaret organized food for the protesters, making huge pots of tea and handing out sandwiches. That night, Davy slipped a battered envelope into Arthur's hands. "There's something you ought to see," he muttered. Inside were legal papers, a copy of Julian Sterling's development permit application, with a list of claims that didn't quite add up. "My cousin's a solicitor," Davy explained. "He reckons there's grounds for appeal. Looks like Mr. Sterling's paperwork's got holes you could drive a horse trailer through." The next morning, the opposition MP's legal team pored over the documents. Within hours, they filed an emergency appeal, citing misrepresentation and breach of council procedure. The council was forced to suspend the eviction, pending investigation. Arthur's lease was temporarily restored. He could keep Kestrel and remain a registered trainer, at least until the inquiry was finished. Margaret wept with relief, collapsing into Arthur's arms as the news spread. "We did it," she whispered, "at least for now." But there was no time to rest. The race at Catterick was only hours away, and the entry window was closing. Arthur rushed to pack his gear, Margaret clutching the precious papers that proved his legal right to race. Neighbors cheered as he led Kestrel onto a borrowed horse trailer, everyone helping, one neighbor with a ramp, another with extra hay, a teenager streaming the whole process live on TikTok. The drive to Catterick was tense. Rain battered the windows, turning the roads slick and muddy. Arthur barely spoke, lost in worry. Margaret gripped his hand, her wedding ring absent but her love stronger than ever. "Whatever happens," she said, "we've already won." The racecourse was nothing like the grand events of Arthur's youth. Instead of the glamour of Ascot, it was a blustery Tuesday afternoon, the stands half empty, except for a crowd of working-class Yorkshire folk clutching banners and Bovril. Even so, the excitement was electric. Reporters jostled for space, kids pressed against the rails, and everywhere Arthur turned, he heard his own name whispered with hope. Conditions were dreadful. Rain had turned the track to muck, a sea of brown and gray. Trainers complained, but Arthur only smiled. "Kestrel's not pampered," he said quietly to Margaret. "She was raised in mud and rain. She'll manage." And Kestrel, strong now, her coat shining in spite of the weather, seemed to sense the importance of the day. The starting bell rang. Arthur steadied Kestrel at the gate, his heart hammering. Around them, the other horses looked sleek, groomed, expensive. Kestrel was the underdog, written off by every bookmaker in the country. The gates flew open. The first stretch was chaos. Kestrel stumbled, boxed in by bigger horses, mud flying in her face. Arthur's heart dropped, but he shouted encouragement, his voice cutting through the roar. "Come on, girl. Remember who you are. Remember who we are." Halfway through, Kestrel found a gap. Arthur clicked his tongue, urging her on. Slowly, steadily, she gained ground, passing one horse, then another. In the final furlong, the crowd screamed as Kestrel, mud-splattered but determined, surged forward. Arthur felt every muscle in her body strain, felt the hope of an entire town riding on her back. With 50 yards to go, Kestrel pulled level with the leader, a massive gelding from a famous stable. Arthur leaned in, whispering, "You can do this, for all of us." Kestrel surged, fueled by months of hard work and the faith of a forgotten community. The finish line loomed. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. And then, by half a length, Kestrel thundered past the post, triumphant. For a second, there was silence. Then the crowd erupted, cheering, shouting, singing, some even crying. Arthur slid from the saddle, tears streaming down his cheeks, his hands trembling so hard he could barely unbuckle the reins. Margaret ran onto the track, heedless of mud, and threw her arms around him. The two of them held each other, surrounded by neighbors and friends, the noise of celebration echoing across the Yorkshire countryside. Reporters rushed in, flashing cameras, thrusting microphones. But Arthur said little. He knelt beside Kestrel, hugging her neck as she nuzzled his shoulder, eyes soft and trusting. All the pain, all the years of struggle and shame, washed away in that muddy winter's circle. That night, the town of Barnsley celebrated. At the pub, songs were sung, toasts were made, and Arthur, quiet and tired but radiant, was the guest of honor. Davy placed Arthur's battered Doncaster cap on his head. "You did us proud, mate," he said, raising a pint. And as Arthur gazed around at the faces, old and young, proud and hopeful, he realized that the true victory wasn't just a horse race. It was reclaiming a piece of dignity, a sense of belonging, and the belief that, even in a changing world, the heart of Yorkshire still beat strong. Yet, as the cheers died down and the rain tapped gently on the window panes, Arthur knew the fight wasn't quite over. There would be more battles, against bureaucracy, against developers, maybe even against his own doubts. But for one shining day, against all odds, Arthur and Kestrel had reminded everyone that sometimes the old ways still had something to teach the new. 6 months had passed since that muddy, miraculous day at Catterick. But for Arthur, life still felt like a whirlwind. The story of an old miner turned horseman and a forgotten mare had spread far beyond Yorkshire. The video of Kestrel's victory trended again and again, picked up by sports blogs, animal rescue forums, even a couple of American racing podcasts. Sometimes, Arthur would catch his own image in the local paper, or hear his name on the radio, and barely recognize himself. For the first time in decades, he could walk down Barnsley High Street with his head held high, neighbors calling out from shop windows, kids grinning and waving. Yet the changes in Arthur's own life were even more profound. The winnings from the race, after taxes and expenses, amounted to £12,000, more money than Arthur and Margaret had seen in years. They paid off the mortgage on their council flat, handing over the final $8,500 with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Margaret ran her hands along the kitchen walls, still marked by years of damp, and whispered, "We finally own it, Arthur. It's really ours." With the remaining $3,500, Arthur made a choice that surprised no one. He rented a proper, permanent training yard on the outskirts of town. No more back alley deals or makeshift paddocks. Now Kestrel and the handful of other rescue horses had solid shelter, green pasture, and the beginnings of a new life. Margaret, at last, could cut back her hours. She dropped to 3 cleaning shifts a week, giving her time to join Arthur at the stables, tending to the horses, and, sometimes, just sitting with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the ridge. They found themselves laughing more, their silences finally peaceful. But Arthur's victory was bigger than his own comfort. In the wake of Kestrel's win, the local council had re-examined Sterling Properties' development plans. The discovery of misrepresented paperwork and overwhelming public support led to the racing grounds being designated a protected community asset. The developers' contracts collapsed and the threat of demolition evaporated. Instead, with the help of a grant from the National Lottery and a flurry of grassroots fundraising, a community equestrian center took shape where the bulldozers once waited. Arthur found himself at the heart of the project, mentoring a group of 12 local teenagers, boys and girls from tough backgrounds who'd never even touched a horse before. Under Arthur's guidance, they learned not just how to ride or muck out stalls, but how to listen, how to care, how to trust. More than one parent told Arthur, sometimes in tears, that their child had finally found a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Tourism blossomed in small ways. An enterprising councilman mapped out Arthur's Trail, a walking route that wound past the stables, the pub, the old training yard, and finally to the paddock where Kestrel still grazed. Local cafes started offering Kestrel's cake and Arthur's brew. The area's economy, long stagnant, began to stir. Still, not all consequences were immediate or obvious. Julian Sterling, for weeks after the race, vanished from the local scene. Some said he'd returned to London, tail between his legs, to answer for lost investors. Others whispered that he was plotting another comeback. But on a drizzly Tuesday, 6 months after Catterick, Arthur received a letter, handwritten with an unfamiliar return address. Julian wanted to meet. Arthur read the letter twice, then a third time, his old suspicions rising. Margaret saw the worry on his face, but said nothing. "He deserves a chance to say his piece," Arthur finally muttered. "We all do." They met in the quiet lounge of the pub, away from the lunchtime rush. Julian looked different, tired, pale, not as sharp as the last time Arthur had seen him. He ordered a cup of tea, fumbling for words. I wanted to apologize," Julian began, his voice low. "I spent years blaming you for what happened to my father. I thought you ruined his life. But I've been reading through his old things. Letters, diaries. I found one from right after the inquiry. He admitted everything. He even called you brave. Said you were right." Arthur stared into his mug. The pain of old wounds tugged at him, but he forced himself to listen. Julian continued, "I was angry at the wrong person for 15 years. My dad wasn't a bad man. He just made some bad choices. I wanted to erase his shame. Now, I realize I need to honor what was good in him and in you." He paused, swallowing hard. "I want to help. Maybe I can volunteer at the stables, learn what you do, use the rest of my company's funds for something that matters." Arthur nodded slowly, a wave of emotions, relief, regret, something close to forgiveness, passing through him. "You're welcome at the yard, lad," he said, "but you'll start with the mucking out. No shortcuts." They both smiled, a cautious truce, the first step towards something like healing. Julian became a fixture at the community yard, awkward at first, but earnest. He used his business know-how to set up a fund in his father's name, supporting local animal rescues. Slowly, the town's attitude toward him softened. Even Margaret, always wary, admitted one evening over stew, "He's got a good heart, that one, if you dig deep enough." Arthur's own role changed too. He was asked to speak at animal welfare events, became a consultant for rescue organizations, and even took on the job of welfare officer for the new equestrian charity. Using his story as a warning and an inspiration, he campaigned for better regulation and education about animal care. In the first year, 50 rescue horses found new homes through his efforts. The youth program expanded, bringing in students from nearby colleges. Arthur partnered with local counselors to offer equine therapy for teenagers battling depression, addiction, or family trauma. Time and again, he saw the way even the toughest kids melted when Kestrel nuzzled their shoulder, or how pride bloomed in a young girl who'd been told her whole life she'd never amount to anything. The old pain didn't vanish. Arthur's son was still in Australia, and the wounds of the past sometimes stung. But the ache lessened with every child who found joy at the stables, every animal given another shot, every moment of laughter shared over strong tea and horse biscuits. One bright morning, as spring crept back into Yorkshire, Arthur stood at the edge of the new paddock, watching a dozen teenagers lead horses through their paces. Margaret waved from the fence, and Julian, sweat-soaked and grinning, helped a nervous girl mount for the first time. In the grass nearby, Kestrel grazed peacefully, her coat shining, her eyes bright and unafraid. A small ceremony was held that afternoon, with tea and scones and more volunteers than Arthur could ever have imagined. As speeches faded, Arthur was asked to say a few words. He hesitated, but Margaret squeezed his hand and nodded. He spoke simply. Sometimes victory isn't about beating someone else. It's about proving something to yourself. We didn't just save a horse. We saved a bit of our history and maybe a bit of our hope, too. Yorkshire isn't about money or who owns what. It's about heart. And as long as we look after each other, that'll never change. Applause rippled through the crowd. Laughter, tears, and proud, shining faces filled the air. As the sun set and the sky glowed with the promise of a new season, Arthur looked at Margaret, at Kestrel, at the people who'd stood by him, and knew, deep in his soul, that this was what legacy really meant. The golden touch of summer had finally replaced the relentless Yorkshire drizzle, and Arthur found himself busier than ever. Life at the Community Equestrian Center had a rhythm. The sounds of teenagers laughing and horses whinnying at dawn, the clatter of hooves on the training track, the constant shuffle of volunteers moving between the stables and the office. Arthur's days were long, but the exhaustion was the good kind, the kind that sent him to sleep every night with the certainty he'd done something meaningful. Margaret thrived too, her role shifting from weary housewife to proud community matriarch. She led the tea rota for the volunteers, welcomed new faces with a smile, and made sure no one left the stables hungry or alone. In the evenings, she and Arthur sat in their now fully paid-off kitchen, the air filled with soft music or the hum of local radio, sometimes falling quiet just to savor the stillness that had once been so rare in their lives. Despite the calm, Arthur was acutely aware of how quickly life could change. His hands ached more with each passing month, and sometimes the old worries crept in late at night. What if the center couldn't pay the bills? What if another Julian Sterling appeared, armed with lawyers and slick promises? The past had taught Arthur never to take anything for granted, and he steeled himself for whatever storms might come. But what came next was nothing he could have predicted. One Tuesday morning, as Arthur was mucking out Kestrel's stall, his mobile phone rang. A strange number, one he didn't recognize. Arthur frowned and wiped his hands, answering with his usual gruff, "Ainsley speaking." The voice on the other end was hesitant but polite. "Mr. Ainsley? My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm with the Royal Equestrian Foundation. We've been following your story since Kestrel's victory, And, well, we'd like to talk to you about something special. Arthur listened, skepticism prickling at the edge of his patience. Olivia continued, "There's a new national program, Equestrian Youth Futures. It's about giving disadvantaged kids opportunities in horsemanship, animal care, and racing. We need people who understand both the sport and the struggle. People like you, Mr. Ainsley. Would you consider heading up the program here in Yorkshire?" For a moment, Arthur could only stare at the sunbeams dusting the stable's rafters. He never saw himself as anything more than a tired old man with a stubborn streak, yet now the Royal Equestrian Foundation, the sort of people who wore tailored jackets and shook hands with royalty, were asking him to lead. He cleared his throat. Well, I'm honored, Miss Bennett, but I'm just... She cut him off gently. "You're exactly what these kids need. Think about it. We'll send the details." After the call, Arthur leaned against the stall door, heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt since his first day at Doncaster. He told Margaret, who promptly burst into happy tears and called Davy and half the neighborhood. That night, the kitchen was full. Volunteers, teenagers, even Julian, crowded around mugs of tea, speculating about what this new opportunity might mean. For the first time, Arthur considered that maybe he could help kids across all of Yorkshire, not just Barnsley. Maybe he could build something that would outlast him, a real legacy. But not everyone was so quick to celebrate. At the community meeting that weekend, a handful of regulars raised doubts. "It's a lot of work, Arthur," said Mrs. Simmons, the club's treasurer. "Would you still have time for the horses here? Would you still have time for us?" Others worried the foundation would take over, or that the center would lose its local, working-class soul. Arthur listened quietly, understanding their fears. Change, even good change, always brought anxiety. After everyone had spoken, Arthur stood. "I started this place with nothing but hope and a stubborn horse," he said, voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we don't lose who we are. But if we can help more kids, give more horses a chance, shouldn't we try?" In the end, the vote was unanimous. "We trust you, Arthur," Davy declared. "We'll back you all the way." Within weeks, Arthur's world expanded again. Olivia Bennett and her team arrived, full of ideas, funding, and new faces. They worked side by side with the locals, never pushing too hard, always asking for input. The youth program doubled, then tripled. Kids came from all over Yorkshire, some shy and anxious, others angry and closed off, all of them carrying burdens too heavy for their years. Arthur and Kestrel became something of a legend, proof that even the most broken could heal, that the forgotten could rise. He taught with patience, stubborn kindness, and stories that never made him the hero, but always made the lessons stick. He saw himself in so many of the kids, their rage, their grief, their desperate hunger for respect. Meanwhile, the local media ate it up. Reporters came for feature pieces. The BBC invited Arthur to a radio segment. An American filmmaker asked to shoot a documentary, though Arthur grumbled that they'd best not turn him into some soppy hero. The truth, as Arthur saw it, was always messier. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes kids gave up, horses relapsed, funding hit snags. But every success, no matter how small, felt miraculous. Julian Sterling threw himself into the work too. He donated land for a second paddock, helped with fundraising, even started training as an equine therapy facilitator. Some evenings, Julian stayed late, cleaning tack and confiding in Arthur about his father, about loss, about guilt and forgiveness. Arthur listened, never judging, offering advice only when asked. One evening, as a pink dusk fell over the fields, Arthur watched Kestrel graze beside a group of teenagers, their laughter drifting on the breeze. Margaret joined him, slipping an arm around his waist. "You know, Arthur," she said, 6 months ago, all you wanted was to save one horse." Arthur smiled, eyes misty. "Aye, but maybe we saved a bit more than that, eh?" Margaret squeezed his hand. "You did more than you ever dreamed, and it's not over yet." That night, Arthur lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart full and aching. For the first time, he didn't worry about what he'd lost: his job, his reputation, even his youth. He thought only of what he'd built, the lives touched, the doors opened, the hope rekindled. He drifted to sleep with one last, quiet thought. That legacy isn't built in grand moments, but in small, stubborn acts of love, again and again, every single day. By autumn, Arthur's world had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The Equestrian Youth Futures program was in full swing, and kids came in waves, some sent by hopeful parents, others by social workers, a few wandering in on their own with nothing but a backpack and a heavy chip on their shoulder. The once quiet community yard was now a hive of activity, ringing with laughter, squabbles, and the steady rhythm of hooves. Arthur, now officially the Yorkshire lead for the national initiative, spent his mornings greeting new arrivals and his afternoons running sessions that were half horsemanship, half life lesson. Some days he marveled at how many young faces looked up to him, some eager, some wary, all hungry for a place to belong. Kestrel, for her part, adapted easily, letting beginners clumsily braid her mane or lean against her for comfort after a tough session. She was more than just a horse. She was a living testament to recovery. Yet with growth came new headaches. The program needed more funding to buy proper equipment and expand the stables. The paperwork alone could bury a man. Olivia Bennett from the foundation was supportive, visiting once a month and bringing both encouragement and mountains of forms to fill. Arthur had never been one for bureaucracy, but Margaret, sharp as ever, stepped in as his unofficial secretary, managing schedules and budgets as if she'd been born to it. The growing pains weren't just administrative. As autumn deepened, a few local parents began to murmur. "It's getting too big," one grumbled at the pub. "Not like it used to be. Too many outsiders. Too many changes." Others complained that their children didn't get enough riding time with the new influx, or that city kids brought trouble. Arthur listened, as always, with patience. But he knew better than to dismiss the old guard. These were the people who'd rallied for him when he needed it most. He called a community meeting in the stables, the smell of hay and horses strong as the Yorkshire wind whistled outside. The meeting began tense, with worries aired and suspicions voiced. Margaret handed out tea and biscuits, her presence as grounding as ever. Arthur stood before them, hat in hand. "I know things are different now," he said. "But this place was built on second chances. For me, for Kestrel, for every kid who comes through those gates. If we forget that, we lose more than a bit of tradition. We lose the whole reason we're here." There was grumbling, but also nods. Davy O'Brien, forever loyal, stood up. "Arthur's right. We all had our day. Let the next lot have theirs." Afterwards, Arthur stayed behind to sweep the stable, joined by a small girl named Amira. She'd been placed at the center after a rough foster home, barely speaking for weeks. That night, she finally broke her silence. "Mr. Arthur," she said softly, "will Kestrel always live here?" Arthur knelt beside her. "As long as I've breath in me, she will. And you're always welcome too, love." Amira smiled, a small, hopeful smile Arthur treasured. Meanwhile, the work never stopped. Julian, ever energetic, brought in new partners, a local college eager to place students in internships, a therapy center seeking to expand their equine-assisted counseling. He even convinced a nearby riding supply shop to donate helmets and boots. The center buzzed with potential. Yet, Arthur sometimes found himself missing the quiet, just him and Kestrel in the dawn mist. One morning, as he mucked out stalls before the crowds arrived, he heard a familiar cough. He turned to see Claire Metcalf, the sharp-eyed journalist who had covered his story from the start. "Thought you'd vanished," Arthur teased, offering her a mug of tea. "Never could stay away from a good story," she replied, smiling. "You've built quite an empire here, Arthur, but that's not why I'm here. There's a bigger story brewing, other stables across the north shutting down, horses being neglected. Thought maybe you'd want to help." Arthur's brow furrowed. "I'll help any way I can." but I'm no savior." "You're proof it can be done," Claire said, eyes serious. "Would you come speak to a group of owners? Lend your name?" Arthur hesitated, remembering how exposure had brought both blessing and pain. But he knew what he owed to the horses and to every kid who'd needed a second chance. He agreed, and within a week, he found himself standing before a crowded hall of anxious owners, trainers, and volunteers from across Yorkshire. He spoke honestly about struggle, about asking for help, about pride and humility. He told Kestrel's story, not as a fairy tale, but as a fight for dignity. The response was overwhelming. Other communities began reaching out, seeking advice, support, sometimes just hope. Back at the stables, Arthur and Julian worked late, drafting a plan for a regional network of support. A helpline, mobile vet units, even pop-up clinics for neglected animals. The foundation was interested, Olivia promising resources if the pilot succeeded. Margaret rolled her eyes at the chaos, but her pride was obvious. Yet, as always, new challenges lurked. The center's popularity attracted attention, some good, some not. A London newspaper sent a reporter who published a half-true story, painting the center as a place for broken kids and broken animals, kept afloat by nostalgia and pity. Social services came for a surprise inspection, and rumors swirled that funding might be cut if standards weren't met. Arthur met the scrutiny head-on, as always. He invited the inspectors to spend a day at the center, working alongside him and the kids. By sunset, the skeptical social worker was laughing as a shy boy showed her how to curry a horse's mane, and the team left reassured. But the episode reminded Arthur how fragile everything still was, how quickly things could slip away. That night, sitting beside Margaret as rain hammered the roof, Arthur confessed his worries. "It feels like the higher we climb, the farther we could fall." Margaret squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. "Maybe, love. But every step up is a chance for someone else. That's worth a stumble or two." Autumn turned toward winter, the hills golden and bare. The stables were quieter in the evenings, but full of warmth, Amira reading to Kestrel, Julian fixing tack in the workshop, volunteers lingering for one more cup of tea before braving the chill. One Friday, as Arthur locked up, a familiar face appeared in the yard, his son, Paul, home from Australia for the first time in years. The reunion was awkward at first, full of old wounds and things unsaid, but Paul walked the fields with Arthur, met the kids, watched Kestrel nuzzle his father's hand. At the end of the week, as they stood side by side under the stars, Paul spoke quietly. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I never understood why you kept fighting. I do now." Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat. "Better late than never, son." Paul smiled. "Maybe I'll bring my family to visit next summer. Maybe I'll even learn to ride." Arthur laughed, wiping away tears in the darkness. "You'll muck out stalls first, lad." Tradition. The world was far from perfect, and the challenges would keep coming, but Arthur knew, surrounded by family, friends old and new, in the spirit of a stubborn horse, that hope, like legacy, was built one day at a time. As the first frost settled across Yorkshire, Arthur's world slowed down. The summer's frantic energy gave way to shorter days and longer shadows. The fields around the stables painted white each morning. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys, and even the town's loudest children wore hats and scarves, their laughter muffled by the chill. At the center, breath hung in clouds above the horses' backs as they stomped and snorted, eager for breakfast. Arthur never let the cold keep him in bed. Before sunrise, he was at the stables, breaking ice from the water buckets, rubbing warmth into Kestrel's neck, making sure each horse had extra hay to fight the winter hunger. Margaret bustled between the tack room and the tiny kitchen, ladling out steaming porridge for the kids before their chores. The center's routines held everyone together. In this frozen landscape, the smallest acts of care, an extra blanket, a bowl of hot soup, a gentle word, felt more precious than ever. But winter brought new trials. The heating system in the old barn finally gave out, and Arthur found himself on the phone with contractors, grimacing at the quotes. Donations slowed as people tightened their own budgets for Christmas. Olivia Bennett from the foundation promised a new grant, but paperwork delayed the funds. At the pub, Davy muttered, "We've come this far, Arthur. Don't let bureaucracy freeze us out." Margaret rolled her sleeves and organized a Christmas fair. Raffles, bake sales, even a carol night in the yard, kids and horses together under strings of fairy lights. One icy Tuesday, Arthur returned from a morning feed to find Amira crying in the corner of the tack room. She tried to hide her face, but Arthur sat quietly beside her, waiting. After a long silence, she blurted, "They're moving me again. New foster family after Christmas. Social worker says it's better, but I don't want to go." Arthur's heart ached, seeing himself in her small, stubborn defiance. He knew too well the pain of being uprooted, of losing what little felt safe. He handed her a brush and nodded at Kestrel's stall. "Horses move all the time, love. But it's not about where you are. It's who stands with you." She sniffed, but she stood, walking toward Kestrel, brushing the mare's mane until her tears faded. That evening, Arthur spoke with Margaret. "We have to do more for kids like Amira. Home shouldn't be just a place. It's a feeling. It's knowing you matter." Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. Meanwhile, Julian brought news both troubling and hopeful. A big racing stable in Leeds is closing. They're letting their staff go. Some are looking for work. A few want to volunteer here. But Arthur, there are 6 horses they can't keep. If they don't find homes soon... Arthur didn't hesitate. "We'll take them. We'll find a way." Julian grinned, already working his phone. Within a week, the newcomers arrived. Thin, anxious, unsure of their fate. The center became a whirlwind, reconfiguring stalls, stretching hay supplies, asking local shops for help. Volunteers rallied, students pulled double shifts, and Margaret's Carol Night became a fundraiser for the Christmas Six. The community that had once doubted outsiders now turned out in force. Farmers donating feed, the local bakery delivering day-old bread, children bringing blankets and carrots. On Christmas Eve, as snowflakes began to fall, Arthur stood in the barn doorway and watched the volunteers laugh and sing around the tree someone had dragged in from the woods. Kestrel and the other horses poked their heads over stall doors, nostrils twitching at the scent of mince pies. Amira, cheeks flushed, handed out mugs of cocoa. Later that night, when the crowds had gone, Arthur found himself alone in the yard. The sky was sharp and clear, the stars dusted across black velvet. For a moment the silence pressed in, not lonely, but full, as if all the years of pain and struggle had led to this gentle peace. He remembered his own childhood Christmases, his mother's hands red from scrubbing, his father's voice booming with carols after a long shift in the mines. Back then, there had never been enough money, but there had always been warmth, always a sense that whatever the world took, family and community would give back. Arthur closed his eyes, letting memories drift over him. He thought of Kestrel, rescued, healed, now a mother figure to the entire herd. He thought of Amira and the other kids, growing stronger with every small victory. He thought of Julian, once an enemy, now a friend and partner. And he thought of Margaret, his anchor through every storm. The wind shifted, and Arthur turned to see Paul, his son, walking up the path. Paul was bundled in a borrowed coat, his steps uncertain on the icy stones. He had arrived a week ago with his own young family, his wife, a toddler son. The reunion had been awkward, sometimes painful, but over the days, the walls had softened. Paul stopped beside Arthur. They stood for a long while, neither speaking. Finally, Paul broke the silence. "I used to hate Christmas," he admitted. "After everything with the racing scandal, I just wanted to run. But watching you here, with everyone, I think I understand now. This place, what you built, it matters." Arthur swallowed hard. Took me a long time to see it, too. It's not about the horses, Paul. Not really. It's about giving people a reason to believe in themselves again. Paul smiled, pulling his little boy onto his shoulders. "I want my son to have that. I want to help, Dad. If you'll have me." Arthur's breath caught, but he only nodded, voice steady. "There's always work here, lad." You know the rules, mucking out first. They laughed together, their breath rising in the cold night. Christmas morning dawned bright and silent, the center blanketed in soft white. Kids and volunteers gathered in the kitchen, singing carols, swapping homemade presents. Margaret served extra porridge, grumbling good-naturedly about muddy boots in her clean kitchen. The horses, old and new, champion and rescue alike, ate their fill and basked in rare winter sun. After breakfast, Arthur called everyone to the yard. He looked at the crowd, faces from every chapter of his life, people changed by loss and hope, by the stubborn work of love. "We've had a hard year," Arthur began, his voice steady as the hills. "But look at us. Look at what we've made. This place is proof that nobody's ever truly alone, unless they choose to be. Family isn't just blood or old memories. It's the people who show up, who fight for you, who laugh and cry with you." The applause was thunderous, echoing out over the frozen fields. As the celebration continued, Arthur caught Margaret's eye across the yard. She smiled at him, warm as spring. For a moment, everything else, fear, doubt, even the ache of old wounds, faded into the background. The world was still uncertain. There would be new winters, new losses, new battles. But as Arthur watched Amira lead Kestrel around the paddock, her voice bright with laughter, he felt something settle deep inside, a sense that, after a lifetime of struggle, he was finally, truly home. The long Yorkshire winter loosened its grip, yielding to the first gentle promises of spring. Arthur felt it in his bones before he saw it, the way the air softened, the daylight stretching further into the evenings, the distant echo of birds returning to the hedgerows. All around the stables, tiny signs appeared, snowdrops along the fence line, the first shoots of grass in the paddock, a stubborn crocus forcing itself up through frozen earth. After months of cold and worry, hope crept quietly back into the world. For Arthur and his family, blood and chosen alike, spring brought new challenges and opportunities. With Paul and his wife staying on, the house was filled with new noise. The patter of his grandson's feet, the laughter of Margaret as she taught her daughter-in-law the secret to a perfect Yorkshire pudding. Paul, still finding his feet, took to stable work with an earnest humility, mucking stalls at dawn and walking the fields with Arthur, listening more than talking. Sometimes they sat together, silent but content, as the horses grazed nearby and the sun slid up over the distant hills. At the center, life hummed. The Christmas Six, once anxious and half-starved, were thriving, their ribs no longer visible and their eyes shining with health. Kestrel, ever the matriarch, seemed to have accepted the new arrivals as part of her herd, sometimes nudging a nervous gelding into the sunshine or standing guard while Amira whispered secrets into her mane. The new year also brought fresh faces to the youth program. Some were there on the advice of social workers or teachers. Others simply showed up, drawn by stories of the stubborn horse that had outrun fate. Arthur met each one with the same gentle firmness, explaining the rules, doling out chores, expecting respect. He saw the way some flinched from touch or retreated from praise, and remembered his own scars, still tender beneath the years. Margaret, as always, was the glue. She ran the kitchen like a command center, handing out jobs and listening to troubles over endless mugs of tea. Her sharp tongue could cut through any nonsense. But her hugs were legendary. More than one child had left the center believing for the first time that a grown-up could be kind and strong at once. Julian, too, had found his place. He took over much of the paperwork and fundraising, using his old contacts to arrange new grants and sponsorships. It wasn't always easy. Some in the town still eyed him warily, memories of the sterling name slow to fade. But his dedication won most people over. He started an apprenticeship scheme for teenagers interested in equine therapy, inviting local professionals to teach sessions on animal care, business skills, and even conflict resolution. In early March, Arthur received an invitation from the Royal Equestrian Foundation. The center was shortlisted for a national award recognizing outstanding contributions to community welfare and animal rescue. Olivia Bennett arrived for a visit, her smile bright as ever. "I knew you could do it, Arthur," she said over coffee. "Your story is giving hope to more people than you realize." Arthur shook his head, embarrassed. Was never about stories. Was just about doing, what was right. Olivia grinned. "Sometimes, those are the best stories." With the arrival of spring came one more unexpected gift, a foal, born to one of the rescued mares on a wet night in April. The entire household kept watch as the mare labored. Arthur knelt in the straw, guiding the tiny, trembling body into the world. When the foal finally stood, blinking at the cheering crowd, Arthur felt tears sting his eyes. They named her Grace. The birth became a moment of celebration, a sign of renewal, and the promise of future days. Even the local press ran a story. Kestrel's legacy, new life at Arthur's stables. And for a time, the whole town felt lighter. But challenges never stayed away for long. That spring, a rash of horse neglect cases surfaced in nearby villages. Claire Metcalf, the journalist, contacted Arthur. "There's a pattern here," she warned. "With the economy tight, more animals are being abandoned. They need you, Arthur, your knowledge, your voice." So Arthur, Julian, and a small team began traveling to neighboring towns, offering pop-up clinics, advice, and sometimes taking in horses who needed immediate care. The network they'd talked about in autumn became real. A loose coalition of stables, charities, and volunteers, united by a stubborn refusal to give up on the forgotten. The work was hard and sometimes heartbreaking. One gelding, found starving and wild-eyed, didn't survive, despite their best efforts. Arthur held the grieving owner, a woman no younger than Margaret, and let her weep against his shoulder. Later, he gathered the kids and volunteers together, telling them gently, "Sometimes we lose, but we never stop trying." In Barnsley, the community center grew ever more vibrant. Spring meant open windows, laughter echoing across the fields, horses dozing in the afternoon sun. Amira, who'd once spoken so little, now led groups of new children on walks, telling them Kestrel's story and teaching them how to listen for a horse's heartbeat. Paul, Margaret, and even Julian's mother, who had quietly moved to town to be near her son, became fixtures in the daily life of the yard. On the last Sunday in April, the entire community gathered for a spring feat. There were games for the children, horse demonstrations, stalls selling jam and fresh bread, and a raffle for riding lessons. Kestrel, led by Amira, wore a crown of wildflowers, and the foal, Grace, trotted beside her, earning delighted applause. As dusk fell and lanterns were strung along the fences, Arthur stood on the paddock fence, looking out at the gathering. He saw old faces and new friends who'd once been rivals, and children who'd once been lost. Paul stood at his side, his little boy on his shoulders, Margaret laughing nearby. Arthur cleared his throat, unsure what to say. Then he raised a mug and a toast. To new life, old friends, and the courage to start again. The crowd cheered, their voices mingling with the spring night. Later, as the lanterns flickered and people drifted home, Arthur and Paul walked the fields, the grass soft underfoot. Paul looked at his father and said quietly, "You know, Dad, I think you finally taught me what home means." Arthur smiled, watching the foal nuzzle against her mother, the center alive with laughter and promise. For all the years he'd fought, against loss, against change, against the temptation to give up, this was his reward. Not medals or glory, but a place where anyone, no matter how broken, could begin again. The moon rose full and bright over Barnsley, lighting up the stables, the fields, and the hearts of everyone who called it home. Arthur turned for the house, his arm around Paul's shoulders, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Summer returned to Barnsley like an old friend. Sunlight poured across the fields, painting the grass in gold, warming every brick and weathered board of the center that had grown from nothing but faith, grit, and a stubborn horse. Children ran through the paddocks, shrieking with laughter, horses lifted their heads and whinnied in greeting, and a gentle breeze carried the mingled scents of hay, clover, and the kitchen's daily bread. Arthur paused at the barn door every morning, letting it all wash over him, a reminder that this, all of it, had once seemed impossible. The center thrived. Olivia Bennet returned with a film crew to document the transformation. A living legacy, she called it, that was inspiring new projects across England. Arthur, uncomfortable in the spotlight, did his best to dodge cameras, but Margaret was right beside him, proud and composed, guiding interviews and making sure every volunteer got their moment. Julian, now respected even by the old guard, oversaw a team of young trainers and handled new grant applications with the confidence of a man who'd finally found his purpose. Paul and his family decided to settle in Barnsley for good. Paul took over many of the daily chores, his son toddling after him through the stables, muddy boots trailing laughter. In the evenings, they'd gather in the kitchen, 3 generations, sometimes more, sharing stories, arguments, and plans for the next day. Margaret called it chaos with a soul. And Arthur agreed, his heart fuller than he'd ever dreamed possible. Spring's foal, Grace, had become the darling of the center, beloved by every child and horse alike. Kestrel, though now grayer around the muzzle, kept a steady watch on her, a living symbol of what patience and love could accomplish. Amira, transformed from a shy foster child into a confident young woman, took Grace under her wing, teaching her to trust the halter, to trot on command, to nuzzle children's hands for apples and praise. One late June afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the center hosted a celebration. 10 years since Arthur's first day with Kestrel, a decade since the world tried to count them both out. The paddock became a festival ground. There were pony rides, sack races, booths for jam and cakes, and a small show ring where the children, many now young adults, demonstrated what they'd learned. The highlight was the parade of horses, led by Amira and Grace, followed by every rescued animal who'd found a home at the center. As they circled the yard, applause and cheers broke out. Arthur, standing beside Margaret, watched with tears in his eyes. All those stories, each animal, each child, each hard-won victory, wove together in that moment. A tapestry of belonging. As dusk gathered, the crowd assembled for speeches. Olivia Bennet stepped forward first, presenting Arthur with a plaque from the Royal Equestrian Foundation, in recognition of extraordinary service to horses and humanity. The applause was thunderous. Julian spoke next, sharing how he'd found forgiveness and a second family here. Paul, usually reserved, surprised everyone by stepping up. "My father's legacy isn't medals or money," he said, voice steady. "It's this. People coming together, believing that change is possible, and never giving up on each other. I'm proud to be his son." Finally, Arthur was called to the front. He gripped the old Doncaster cap Davy had once given him, searching for words. He looked at Margaret, her steady smile, her unwavering faith. He looked at Amira, at Paul and his grandson, at Julian and Olivia, at the faces of every volunteer, every child, every neighbor who'd stood beside him when hope seemed lost. He cleared his throat, voice rough but sure. "I've spent a lifetime chasing something. Respect, maybe. A redemption. There were days I thought I'd lost it all. Days when the world said I was finished, just another old man and a broken horse. But I learned something here. You're never too old, too lost, or too broken to matter. What counts is showing up, doing the work, loving hard, even when it hurts, giving others a chance. Because someone, somewhere, once gave you one." He paused, letting the silence settle. The crowd watched, rapt. This center isn't just bricks and wood. It's every hand that built it, every heart that believed. It's proof that legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you share while you're still here. A gentle hush lingered before the applause rose, warm and honest, echoing across the fields. As twilight deepened, the celebration continued, music and dancing, laughter and stories under strings of glowing lights. The children ran races with the foal. Teenagers took selfies with Kestrel. Old friends toasted with mugs of strong tea and local ale. Arthur and Margaret slipped away to the edge of the paddock, sitting on the old bench overlooking the fields. They watched the fireflies rise, the stars come out one by one, the world settling into peace. Margaret leaned against Arthur's shoulder. "Did you ever think it would end up like this?" she asked softly. Arthur shook his head, a wry smile on his lips. Not in a million years. But I'm glad I lived long enough to see it. She squeezed his hand. You didn't just see it, Arthur. You built it. From the paddock came the gentle sound of hooves, Grace trotting after Kestrel, Amira calling to them in the dark. In the house, Paul's laughter rang out, followed by his son's delighted shout. The lights of the center glowed, a beacon against the night. Arthur closed his eyes, breathing in the cool summer air. For all the loss, all the battles, all the years he'd feared he'd never find his way home, he had arrived, full circle. He'd proved, to himself and to the world, that dignity, hope, and love could outlast any storm. And as the night deepened, Arthur Ainsley, old miner, stable hand, forgotten knight, father, friend, sat surrounded by the legacy he never thought he'd have. In the hearts of everyone whose lives he'd touched, and in the home they had built together, he had finally won the only race that mattered. Underscore, 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 underscore. Sometimes victory isn't about beating the odds or crossing the finish line first. Sometimes it's about having the courage to begin again, to give others a chance, and to build a legacy of hope. Arthur didn't just save a horse. He reminded a town and himself what it truly means to belong.